All right, welcome in everybody to the deep dive. Today we're gonna be talking about van life.
Van life.
Yeah, and we see these pictures online, and it's always so picturesque and beautiful, and it's the dream,
A
right?
dream.
Yeah, so we're really gonna dive into this podcast episode called "Van Life Nightmares: The Dark Side of Wanderlust."
Right.
And this podcast episode, I mean, it's perfect because it really gives this more conversational, anecdotal view of what it's actually like to live in a van full time.
Yeah, it's a very different perspective from those perfectly filtered Instagram photos.
Right. And that's really the mission for today is to show you, the listener who appreciates those aha moments and
Hmm.
enjoys gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly.
Yeah.
Really to show you, maybe some of the struggles that aren't as publicized when it comes to van life.
Right.
And to really contrast that with, um the more positive view that we see online.
Well, it's not necessarily to just dwell on the negative, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
It's more about presenting a balanced perspective.
Exactly, a realistic perspective.
Because for someone who's thinking about this lifestyle,
Yeah.
it's crucial to understand the full picture.
Absolutely. So the source material here is this podcast called Wheels in Wilderness,
Yeah.
and it's hosted by Alex and Sam. And they, right away they set the stage by, acknowledging the allure,
The
the
idea.
allure of this, this Wanderlust thing.
Right.
But then, they also quickly jump into this idea of, what are some of the wild, weird, sometimes what were they thinking, aspects of nomadic living.
Exactly.
Like I love the example they give of having a composting toilet.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Right. Like, people don't really think about that, do they?
Not really. It's not the first thing that comes to mind when you see those beautiful photos of vans parked in scenic locations.
Right.
But it's a very real and often smelly aspect of the lifestyle.
Yeah. And I guess it's really all about finding that balance, right?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the key takeaways for our listeners today.
Yeah. Like, how do you find that balance between, the dream, that social media illusion of freedom and adventure, and, the more the nitty-gritty, the realities of everyday van life, like finding a place to park, dealing with
Yeah, the mundane tasks.
the mundane tasks that, you wouldn't necessarily think about.
Right, like where do you get water?
Yeah.
How do you manage waste? What happens when something breaks down in the middle of nowhere?
Right.
These are all things that social media doesn't really show you.
Absolutely. So let's kind of break this down. Let's start with what they call the Instagram illusion.
Okay, so the Instagram illusion,
Right.
it's all about, this curated version of reality, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you see these perfectly staged photos of vans by the beach.
By the beach.
Fairy lights, adorable dogs, laptops open.
It's like the perfect, remote work lifestyle.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it looks so effortless.
But what Alex and Sam point out is that beach is probably like scorching hot.
Scorching.
Right.
Yeah, and that cute dog's probably shedding all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
And that laptop's probably dead because they didn't get enough sun for their solar panels.
Oh, I hadn't even thought about the solar panel.
Right. Like it's not always sunny and breezy.
Right. Yeah. And what about, those things that are just totally left out of the frame, right?
Exactly.
Like the fact that, you need to constantly be finding sources of fresh water,
Water.
or
Yeah.
that mold is like a huge problem in these small spaces.
It can be a nightmare, especially with the humidity and condensation.
Yeah. It's not all glamorous, is it?
Not at all. And then there's the whole aspect of relationships.
Oh, yeah. Being stuck in a tiny van with someone 200
At 347, it can put a lot of strain on even the strongest of bonds.
And the podcast actually makes this hilarious observation. They say that eternal romance on the road
The eternal romance.
can quickly devolve into, I will literally push you into a canyon.
Yeah.
Which, obviously is hyperbole, but
Of course, yeah.
but it really highlights the potential for conflict.
It does. It really does. It's like
Yeah.
you're under a microscope, All your little quirks and habits are magnified.
Exactly, yeah. And for our listeners, I think it's so important to understand that, going into this lifestyle,
Yeah.
there are going to be challenges.
Challenges.
Right? That you might not even be thinking about.
Absolutely. And challenges that are very different from what you might imagine based on those curated Instagram feeds.
Absolutely. So moving on, the the podcast has this great segment called "Oh Crap Moments,"
Oh, crap moments, yeah.
and this is where they really start to get into the more the potential disaster.
Yeah, the things that can really go wrong.
Right. Yeah. So we're talking about mechanical breakdowns, creepy encounters,
Creepy encounters.
hygiene-related
Yeah.
emergencies. All the fun stuff.
The glamorous side of van life.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, Alex and Sam, they really don't shy away from these kind of less refined aspects of living on the road. And one of the things that they bring up is the bathroom situation.
The bathroom situation.
Right, which as Sam so delicately puts it, often involves just a bucket.
A bucket.
Or maybe a bush if you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
Right. And I think this is really interesting for the listener because
Yeah.
it really challenges our assumptions about what's considered normal, right?
Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
when you're living in a van, basic necessities like going to the bathroom take on a whole new meaning.
Right. And they also give this great piece of advice, which is to be very wary of gas station burritos in that context.
In that context, yeah.
So,
You don't want to be caught short, so to speak.
right, exactly.
No pun intended.
So they share this really funny story about a guy named Jake who tried to take a shower in his van
Oh, yeah. I remember Jake.
using a hose, right?
The hose, yeah.
And the hose leaked.
The hose leak.
And he ended up flooding his entire van.
Turning it into a mobile sauna.
A mobile sauna, right. So, it's those kind of little mishaps
That can happen.
that can happen,
Yeah.
but, are funny in retrospect.
Yeah.
But
But in the moment.
in the moment, they're probably pretty frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But then they also get into, some of the more, I guess, some of the scarier aspects of van life.
What? Yeah.
Like what happens if you break down in the middle of nowhere
In the middle of nowhere.
and you have no cell service?
Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario.
And it's like, Sam describes it as like the opening scene of a horror movie.
Right.
Like the Wi-Fi's out forever.
Forever.
Yeah. So it's, it's funny, but it also highlights this very real vulnerability.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
And it's something that, people who are used to the comforts and conveniences of modern life might not fully appreciate.
Yeah, they might not think about that. And, going back to that listener voice memo we heard from Sarah from Colorado.
Sarah?
I mean, her story about, waking up to raccoons in her trash, then her van wouldn't start, no cell service,
Right.
stuck eating cold beans.
It's like a van life horror story come to life.
Right. And Sam even says, nature, 1, Sarah, 0.
Yeah.
Which I thought was pretty fun.
It's a good one. But it also kind of underscores how, things can go from bad to worse pretty quickly when you're out there on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not always just about, raccoons and breakdowns, right?
Yeah.
There's also the financial aspect of van life.
Yeah, the financial reality.
Which is, what we're going to talk about next. So a lot of people, they think about van life as being this, super affordable way to travel and live, right?
Right. The allure of ditching the rent or mortgage payment.
Yeah. But the podcast, they kind of challenge that assumption.
They do. They have a segment called Money Pit on Wheels.
Money Pit on Wheels.
Yeah, very appropriate.
And they give this really really kind of absurd example
Yeah.
of Sam's friend who spent $800 on a vintage sink.
$800?
Yeah, $800
On a sink.
only to discover that it didn't fit in the van.
Didn't fit.
And now it's just sitting in their backyard as a flower pot.
A very expensive flower
A
pot.
very expensive flower pot.
Yeah. And I think that really highlights for our listeners that, the costs can really add up in unexpected ways.
Absolutely. And it's not just, fancy sinks, right?
No.
It's also things like, getting parking tickets for trying to park stealthily.
Oh, yeah, the parking ticket.
Or having to make unexpected repairs on your van.
Yeah, because let's face it, most vans that are converted for this lifestyle are not brand new.
Right, yeah. They've got some miles on them.
They've got some miles, some wear and tear.
Exactly. And those repairs can get expensive.
They can. They can.
And then, the podcast also talks about this idea of a van life tax.
Oh, the van life tax, yeah.
And what they mean by that is, they've noticed that a lot of businesses, especially like, trendy coffee shops and places that cater to the, the van life crowd,
Yeah. Yeah.
they seem to charge a little bit more.
A little premium.
A little premium.
Like
yeah.
maybe they figure, hey, these van lifers, They're out there living the dream. They can afford to spend a little extra.
Right.
Or maybe it's just that, those kinds of businesses tend to be in areas where prices are already higher.
Yeah, could be. But it's definitely something to, to think about.
It is. It's a hidden cost.
Mm-hmm.
You might not factor that into your budget.
Yeah. So, okay, so we've talked about, the Instagram illusion, the oh crap moments, the financial realities.
The reality.
What about safety insanity?
Safety insanity, yeah.
Because living on the road, it presents its own unique set of risks.
It does. It does. You're not in a traditional home with, locked doors and neighbors nearby.
Right, yeah.
You're more vulnerable.
You're more vulnerable, yeah. And, Sam gives some really good advice on, how to mitigate those risks.
Oh, yeah, like
always have a backup plan.
Backup plan, yeah.
In case something happens.
In case your van breaks down or you find yourself in a sketchy situation.
Right. And carry pepper spray.
Pepper spray.
Just in case.
For protection, yeah.
And then he also says something really interesting. He says, try to project this vibe of, I'm not worth robbing.
I'm not worth robbing, yeah.
Which, I thought was kind of funny.
Yeah.
But also kind of makes sense, right?
It does, yeah. Don't make yourself an obvious target.
Right.
Don't be flashing a lot of cash or expensive gear.
Exactly.
Be discreet.
Be discreet, yeah.
Blend in.
But, it's not just about physical safety.
Right.
There's also mental health to consider.
Mental health, yeah. That's huge.
Because van life can be, it can be pretty isolating.
Isolating.
Right, especially if you're traveling solo or you're spending a lot of time in remote areas.
Yeah. And even if you're traveling with someone, you're still, kind of in this little bubble.
Yeah, yeah.
Removed from your usual support network.
Right. And then there's this thing that the podcast calls decision fatigue.
Decision fatigue.
Which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
And what they mean by that is, you're constantly having to make decisions.
Constantly.
Right. About, where to park, where to get water, where to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, like even simple things become decisions.
Right. Yeah. Like, do I drive 2 hours to find a shower or do I just use a baby wipe?
Right. Exactly. Those everyday choices that most people don't even think about.
Yeah. It can be exhausting.
It can be mentally draining.
Yeah. And it's something that, a lot of people probably don't anticipate.
Right. They don't realize the mental toll that constant decision making can take.
So, okay. So we've talked about, all the downsides, the challenges. But the podcast does end on a more, positive note.
Yeah, it does.
They have a segment called Tips to Survive and Thrive.
Tips to survive and thrive.
Which, I think is really helpful for our listeners.
Absolutely, because it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
There are ways to make van life work.
Right. And so Sam's top 3 tips. The first one is to, test your setup.
Test your setup, yeah.
In your driveway.
In your driveway.
For a week.
For a week.
Before you actually hit the road.
Before you hit the road.
Just to kind of get a feel for what it's actually like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to imagine living in a van. It's another thing to actually do it.
Right. And, you might discover things that you didn't even think about.
You might. Like maybe your bed's not as comfortable as you thought it would be.
Or, maybe you don't have enough storage space.
Or maybe you just realize that you really miss having a full-size bathroom.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great tip. And then the second tip is to budget double what you think you'll need.
Double, yeah.
Which, I think is really smart.
It is. It's about being prepared for those unexpected expenses.
Right, because there are always going to be unexpected expenses.
Always. Especially when you're dealing with an older vehicle and you're traveling to new places.
Yeah. And then the third tip is to learn to laugh when things go wrong.
Laugh when things go wrong.
Which I think is, probably the most important tip of all.
It might be. Because things will go wrong.
Oh, yeah.
That's just part of van life.
It's inevitable.
It's inevitable.
Yeah.
But if you can find the humor in those situations,
yeah,
it'll make the whole experience a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah. And then Alex chimes in with, his essential packing item.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Duct tape.
Duct tape.
He says, duct tape is the universal fix-all for van life.
Yeah, it's pretty much essential for any DIY project or repair.
Yeah, gotta love duct tape. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the often unseen realities of van life.
The realities.
I think, what's really clear is that there's this big gap between, the the picture perfect images that we see online.
Yeah, the Instagram illusion
Yeah, the Instagram illusion.
versus the actual day-to-day experience.
Right. So, for a listener who, enjoys gaining knowledge efficiently and appreciates those aha moments, I think what they've really gained from this episode is this much more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of what van life is actually like.
Yeah, it's about having realistic expectations.
Realistic expectations, yeah. Because, while the freedom and the adventure are definitely appealing,
Appealing.
it's important to be aware of the practicalities and the potential downsides as well.
Absolutely. Because it's not for everyone.
It's not for everyone.
But for those who are prepared and who go into it with their eyes wide open,
Yeah.
it can be an incredibly rewarding experience.
Absolutely. So, as you're listening to this, think about what aspects of long-term travel or alternative living are really essential for you.
Yeah.
And what compromises are you willing to make?
Right.
Because, whether you're thinking about van life or some other, non-traditional path,
Yeah.
there are always going to be trade-offs.
Always.
So it's really about finding what works best for you,
Finding your own
finding your own balance. Yeah.
your own version of the dream.
Absolutely.
And that's what this is all about, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, that's it for this week's deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
We'll